Let us pray together. Be with us this morning, God. Quiet our hearts. May our spirits be still, that we might hear from you. Amen. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So says Jesus in both the beginning and the end of today's passage. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And here's of whom he speaks: the poor, the hungry, the meek, the merciful, the peacemakers. Theirs, Jesus says, is the kingdom of heaven. It's, of course, a well-known passage. The Beatitudes, we've come to call this. And I don't know anyone who doesn't love this passage. I don't know anyone who doesn't find it moving and poignant. But in the same way, I don't know a whole lot of people who live as if it were true. And I certainly include myself in that list of those who do not. Because the simple truth is everything about this moving, poignant passage is dissonant with our daily human experience. Most of us don't pine for a kingdom where power inheres in weakness. Most of us pine for a kingdom that looks like, well, a kingdom. Which leads me to a story. One of the great lessons I ever learned was from my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Meredith. For months, we as a class had endeavored to memorize all the state capitals. In fact, we worked so hard at it that Mrs. Meredith held a state capital bee at the study's end, where each student was pitted against everyone else in a winner-take-all competition. It's a fierce battle, tough competition. And it would be far beside the point for me to tell you that I won. That fact has no bearing on this sermon. It would just be simple, prideful bragging, so I won't tell you that. No, the point of this story is to tell you something Mrs. Meredith had us do at the end of this state capitals study. After those 2 long months of memorization, months where we every day considered the map of the United States, looked at its boundaries and its demarcation lines, its shape and its topography. After all of that, one day Mrs. Meredith handed us a rendering of the United States turned upside down. Same shape, same boundary, same topography, only exactly upside down. Maine was where California ought to be, Florida where Washington, the Mexican border where the Canadian. And after she'd passed out these papers, she simply asked us, "Who can tell me what you're looking at?" And we were stumped. For minutes we sat there, not one of us could answer her question, not even that student who'd won the state capitals bee, whoever he might have been. Well, finally, after those long minutes of incomprehension, she said to us, "Try flipping the paper upside down." And we did. Suddenly it was obvious. It was the same landmass we'd spent 2 months studying. The same territory we'd been looking at every day for 8 straight weeks. And here, with this slight change of perspective, not one of us recognized it. And so Mrs. Meredith said, and here's the point of my telling you this. Mrs. Meredith said, "Class, in life we get used to seeing things in only one way, from only one perspective. And so the trick to being a good human being, not just a good student, is learning to see things from other perspectives." And she paused and then she added, "The real trick is to learn to see things that aren't as if they are." Well, as you can imagine, that puzzled me as a 10-year-old. What on earth did it mean to see things that aren't as if they are? Well, that leads me to the 5th century theologian Augustine. Perhaps more than anyone else, Augustine is responsible for the shape of the Western Church today. The man was simply brilliant, an intellect unmatched in his own day and quite possibly ever since. His body of work is enormous, and there's no theological doctrine he didn't help clarify in ways that benefited those who sought to follow Jesus Christ. Truth is, I love Augustine, and I could talk about him all day, but here's why I mentioned him this morning. In his landmark book, The City of God, Augustine was responding to the charge that Christianity had been a scourge on Rome. That Christianity was the thing that had weakened the Roman Empire and had brought about its ultimate decline. And critics argued that Christians, in their peacemaking ways, their refusal to get involved in Roman power grabs, and their bullheaded insistence on loving everyone, even their enemies, critics held that this was the reason Rome had fallen apart. And so for what? They wondered. For this so-called kingdom of God, this elusive idea the Christians kept yammering on about? Well, this kingdom clearly hadn't come to pass. No, new global powers were now setting in, usurping Rome's long-standing power and authority, and thus Christians, they believed, had innervated Rome, weakened it. And for what? Critics asked. For the senseless hope of a peaceable kingdom that does not and cannot exist. And so Augustine, the chief spokesperson for the Christian faith, writes The City of God as a response to that criticism, a 1,000-plus page response to that criticism. And what he says in the book is both remarkably brilliant and equally difficult to swallow. The reason it appears this way, Augustine says, is because there are actually two kingdoms. There's the city of man, as he calls it, and there's the city of God. There's the visible kingdom, and there's the invisible kingdom. And Christians, Augustine explains, are members of the city of man, yes, but more importantly, Christians are also citizens of the city of God. They are members of the visible kingdom, yes, but they are also members of the invisible kingdom. And the invisible kingdom, Augustine explains, is growing and is spreading and is becoming more and more what God is calling it to be. But the thing about this kingdom, Augustine claims, is that it is invisible. Invisible for the simple reason that under the current order, under the current corruption, that is the human condition, worldly power, which is to say the power on which the city of man runs, worldly power, Augustine says, always appears to triumph. Because people do take advantage of goodness. And people do take advantage of kindness. And people do take advantage of mercy. And people do take advantage of love. That's just the way it works. And thus it appears, Augustine says, that the city of man, the visible city, is dominating the invisible city of God. But it's not, Augustine argues. And he goes on to say that if one could simply see it from God's vantage, if one could simply see it from the eternal perspective, then they'd see how goodness and kindness and mercy and love will live on and bear fruit, growing into something beautiful and massive and eternal, while dominance and selfishness and belligerence will ultimately come to nothing, shriveling down into something soulless and lifeless and empty. And then he quotes Psalm 2 to underscore his point, which says, "The nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain. The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together. But the one enthroned in heaven has the final say, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, on my holy mountain." In other words, the city of God. But enough about the city of God, the book. Here's why I bring it up this morning. Because what Augustine is trying to persuade his critics to do and see in the city of God is the same thing Mrs. Meredith was trying to persuade us to do and see as fourth graders, which is to see things that aren't as though they are. And that finally brings me back to Jesus and his disciples standing together on that mountaintop. Here in this moment, speaking to his disciples these words which we've come to know as the Beatitudes, Jesus is here, in essence, showing his students of an upside-down map and asking them to tell him what they see. Jesus is, in essence, saying that which Mrs. Meredith said, which was to be a quality human being, to be the kind of human being we were designed to be. We have to learn to see things that aren't as though they are. And so then, taking the metaphor further, what was the upside-down map Jesus was showing them? What was upside down in this lesson? Everything. This was not simply Maine in the place of California. Now, this was peace winning out over fighting. This was mercy winning out over retribution. This was poverty winning out over wealth. This was righteousness winning out over deceit. In other words, this was the complete reverse of the entire way the world works. The entire way the world worked then, and the entire way that the world works now. Which leads me back to what I said at the top, which is that most of us find these words moving and poignant, but few of us live as if they were actually true. Because here's the simple truth if we look out at the world. Poor aren't blessed. Just last night, some 528,000 of them slept on a street somewhere here in America. That isn't blessed. Those who hunger are not blessed. No, what they do is search in vain for their next meal, some of them, if they're lucky, finding their way to a soup kitchen or something such as that. That isn't blessed. Those who make peace are not blessed. The peacemakers are mocked, stomped on, and spit right out. Just monitor Facebook. See what happens when someone tries to peacefully resolve a hot-button political issue between her friends. And hey, speaking of hot-button political issues, the meek are not blessed. No matter what one's politics might be, we all know that. Now, the meek sit starving and persecuted in refugee camps the world over, hoping, most often in vain, that those with the power and wherewithal to help them out will actually do it. We could go on and on. Point being, it is no different today than it was in Augustine's day, just as it was no different in Augustine's day than it was in Jesus's. For the visible kingdom, the city of man, the very structure of world power, chews up and spits out the poor and the meek and the hungry and the merciful and the peacemakers. It always has, and until Christ should come again, appears it always will. But the gift of Christ, the insight we claim comes through Christian faith, is the ability to see these truths as if they weren't. Better yet, the power of Christian faith is that it enables us to see things that aren't as though they are. It's the very thing Paul writes in his first letter to the Corinthians. And the very heart of the Christian story, that which Paul claims is foolishness to the rest of the world, is the very case in point. For Jesus Christ died at the hands of worldly power. Worldly power strung him to a tree and crucified him. And there was nothing special to see here. That's the way things work. That's the way things are. Here's what the Christian story says. The Christian story says that 3 days later, Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And in so doing gave a lie to the very basis, the very foundation of worldly power. And there is something to see here. Because if indeed this happened, and I believe wholeheartedly that indeed this happened, if indeed this happened, then this is the first tangible case of seeing things that aren't as though they are. And to see that is to see the city of God. And that is what Jesus called his disciples to see when they stood there that day on that mountain. Just as that is what Jesus calls us to see this very day. He calls us to see that the Beatitudes are more than just moving words. He calls us to see that the Beatitudes describe the world as it ought to be. He calls us to see the role we are to play in bringing that world about. And thus he calls us to join him in the incredibly difficult task of living in an upside down kingdom.